One of the most interesting aspects of artistic style, of how we perceive style, be it in cinema or in comics or animation or video games, is the concept of form versus shape. One of the reasons this particular concept is so slippery and a little bit hard to really understand, or at least it was for me in the beginning, is because it underpins a lot of how we perceive the world and how we often think we also perceive the world. Frequently, we look at objects and we do think of their form, their structure. You could look at my head and you can imagine the different planes that are there, and you kind of record it as a three-dimensional object. And that's often what we're trying to do when we learn art, to learn structure, form, anatomy, and often we're taught to figure out how to represent that with form, with tone, to actually define one plane from another using value. But then you also view the world through very iconographic and symbolic windows. We often perceive faces and objects and things in our mind, and we remember them in a more sort of iconic way. This is why an icon of something like a hammer or a face is so easily understood by everyone, and that often a cartoon of my face may be actually a better way to express who I really am. So this is a nuanced concept, and what I want to do in this video is just try and break this down and show you how I think this relates in many ways to a lot of the styles you might encounter in entertainment design across cinema, video games, animation, comics, illustration, etc. I think it's one of the major things that you have to consider in the beginning, and it's also one of these things you need to learn to leverage depending on what type of style, mood, and effect you want to get with your art. As usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is going to be neither fast-paced nor heavily edited. In this case, it's just going to be me and you in Photoshop. I'm just going to share with you a bunch of images, and we're just going to talk about this really important aspect of illustration and picture making and design, and just kind of how we perceive the world. Personally, for me, this caused a lot of frustration until I properly understood it. So my goal here is just to give you some tools to understand the styles that you see around you. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, if you'd like to learn more about illustration and picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. It charts my journey going from an amateur to a professional, and I talk a lot about really important issues such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to plan your images, create thumbnails, and also a few thoughts on how to approach being a professional artist. As I said, it's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out if that's something you're interested in. All right, here we are in Photoshop. So first, let me just quickly jump in and I'll describe exactly what we are looking at. Here I've got an image that is essentially the same. I've got an image. These are two images that I did in the line and color style. And here we've got a character who's small and a giant sort of ogre character. And in both cases, we're dealing with the same sort of subject matter, but one has much more of a focus on shape, and form and lighting plays a very sort of low role in how the image works. And that's the top one. And this is typically where you would view it more as like a cartoony style, or it's often sort of referred to as like a French clean line style, where we have sort of clean lines, or these are not that clean, and sort of flat color. Like an animation style look or something like that. The key insight here is that lighting, the way that the light falls across the form, is having a very low impact on how someone perceives the image. It feels much more as if all the lights are on, there's lots of sunlight, and there's not many shadows. Very diffuse lighting scenario. Here we got another one, and this is different, right? In this case, we perceive a lot of the image, although it's still in my style and I still have a comic booky style. So it's not 100% painted. It's not 100% based on lighting, but in many ways, we are looking at and understanding the image more through the lighting. And the thing is that often this does combine with the type of feeling you get in an image and the sort of way that it's easy or not easy to understand what is happening. Often, when we are looking at form-based images, often when lighting plays a big role in it, it's because we are needing to understand the lighting to understand the form. Like, we can't often perceive the actual sort of shapes of things. We are often using the light and the dark side to build a picture of the shape and the form and what's sort of actually underneath there. And again, I'll unpack this as we sort of move along. Whereas with this one, we're looking much more at something where the lights are all on. There's no inability to understand what is sort of happening, and it's a lot more sort of open. And the way that we perceive this is much more through like one object versus another object. Here's a big shape versus another shape. And again, we're not quite as concerned with the lighting. Whereas you can see in this image, there's a lot of stuff where some forms are kind of blending into others because they're not in the light. And we're getting the primary sort of contrast punch in the middle here, right, around the creature's kind of face. Again, this is still a hybrid sort of style. It's obviously not, it's obviously rendered with a lot of liberty, but that's like a good understanding of the difference. And there's probably different ways you could describe this concept. A good way to sort of think about it is, are the lights on, are the lights off? Or fundamentally, this is not a name, but does lighting and form, does the light play a major aspect or a major role in the way that you perceive the image and understand it? The interesting thing is you would sort of imagine that, okay, cinema or something where things are real and there is form would obviously always be something where it's form-based. And in a lot of cases, that is the case, but I've got some good examples here where I think we can see that that's not necessarily true, and that no matter what medium or genre or sort of technique you're using, this is something that is a major part of how you make an image that works. So here I've got some good examples. I've got some Wes Anderson sort of frames from Wes Anderson, the director. Again, I'm not always up on sort of who is the cinematographer on all these sort of projects, so I apologize for that. And here we've got some Ridley Scott Blade Runner and some Ridley Scott sort of original Alien frames. And you can see that these are both obviously shot of real people, and that there's form in all of them, right? If you look at these Wes Anderson frames, got some great sort of symmetrical, formalized compositions, nice repetition of shapes, and great color contrast. All these things that are kind of sort of work from an illustrative point of view, similar with this frame. And the lighting is there, right? Obviously, we can see that there is lighting and form and shape, and that there is actually, sort of shadows on the faces. But the key thing is that the dominant way that you understand the image is not necessarily through looking at the light and the dark. Everything's kind of lit fairly uniformly. The way you would probably describe this is there's a lot of fill light. And so although we can see form on sort of Bill Murray's face, the difference in contrast between the light and the shadow side is very minimal. Same with these ones, right? The light and the shadow side is very minimal, and it's quite soft as well, right? We're not getting a lot of real sort of harsh shadows. There's a lot of soft shadows, and everything's kind of pretty open. It's fairly evenly lit. And so what we're left with a sort of typical Wes Anderson directed film is a lot of these images that are very flat, but we perceive them through shape. So you perceive the character's face, you perceive the features, you perceive the shape of the hat, you perceive the shape of the sort of top, and all of these other little aspects. So it's more like a whole bunch of different shapes put on top of each other. And we rely a lot more on, often in this case, you do see a good overlap, but not always, of high color contrast as a way to sort of define contrast within the frame, because often you don't have the tonality from light and dark. Again, that's another one of these concepts we have dug into on the Drawing Codex sort of YouTube channel, talking about elements of picture making, sort of color versus tonal contrast. So these are intertwined a little bit, but not always, as you sort of see. But yeah, so even in film, you can have something like a Wes Anderson film where It really is just about shapes. We're perceiving the front-on shape of someone's face, and they're not sort of occluded by shadow. We're not really even leaning into the beauty of the light and the dark and the way that that sort of cinematography would be perceived. It really is just a matter of these graphic frames that have a lot of one shape versus another, one object versus another. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, let me know in the comments down below if that kind of tracks. Here we have some, and this is where again it gets a bit sort of squirrely. You kind of can often have, obviously, something that is more of a film noir look. So we've got Blade Runner, and a really sort of classic scene from that film, and you can see that there is a lot of shape here as well. And that's why, again, shape is not necessarily the best way to kind of look at this, but it's understanding that the way we perceive these frames is primarily by the light. The shape always helps. It's always good to have good shape design. But the thing that we're really often looking at here is the light and the way the light tells us what's happening with the form. So even though, these are sort of interesting, we can tell a lot about, if we zoom out, we can tell a lot more about these Wes Anderson frames just from the shapes than we can here, right? The shapes still read, but we can't really tell who the characters are. We can't sort of really read what's going on. And again, another sort of good example of a face that we perceive primarily through the shapes that are created by light and dark, and the same with all of the different sort of objects. So we're less worrying about like, oh, this character has a red hat on, and we just sort of perceive the light and dark forms across sort of a massive sort of conglomerated colors. And it would be a similar sort of thing with something like Alien, right? We're looking at the way these faces are created, and the thing that we're really using to sell the image and the way that we understand the image is primarily through light and dark. If you weren't a human and you couldn't perceive the world through light and dark, you would have a hard trouble understanding what is going on here, because it's just sort of a mishmash of different shapes that we kind of perceive and go, oh, I know what that is, that's a face. Same thing here, even when we have quite an evenly sort of lit frame, there still is an ambiguity to a lot of these forms where your brain has to process and understand what's happening through the light and the dark. And that's kind of just a primary way here where you're able to sort of perceive what's going on through the lighting. Again, there's no hard delineation. Some images are really going to lean into needing lighting to understand. Some are going to be in the middle. And some, like the Wes Anderson sort of shots, are really going to lean into, hey, this is mostly about shape. Now, I think the interesting thing is that often I think, Alien is a good example of this, because often I think horror is linked to this concept of lights are off and we're perceiving the world through light and shadow. And in a similar way, film noir, where you're having to perceive what's going on. There's an ambiguity about film noir. Things are in light, things are in dark. You're having to understand what's happening. And this is a key thing you would find in Blade Runner, right? Like, we're in the dark. We have this man in the darkness. We see shapes. He's blending into this shape over here. So this is occluded. We have contrast here, contrast there. So this sort of often brings up that idea that you have where you're in the darkness. You can't really tell what's going on. And you're using as much of your understanding of how the light is affecting the forms around you to pick one thing out from another. You can't see a red hat. You can't see a blue shirt. All you can see is just light and dark and form. And it's often that form that helps us understand things. This does, however, put us in this light or dark kind of slightly worried state. And horror films need this frequently to really function, because often when you are a human and you're in the dark and you can't see what's going on, it is a little bit more stressful because you're not quite sure where you are. And we inherently have that fear of the dark because it challenges our perceptual systems. And I think you can see this on a gradient, right, in terms of like stress and challenge for the viewer. Whereas these shots in, like, again, a classic sort of Wes Anderson film are very unchallenging to look at. It's very easy for us to see what's going on, to read the features read the faces. We don't have to do the combination of understanding the form and the expression to figure out sort of what's going on. So there's a lot of sort of interesting things here that we'll sort of unpack, but that's just a good breakdown of kind of what we're talking about here. Are the lights on? Are the lights off? Am I primarily having to understand the lighting within the scene to understand it? Or am I primarily sort of stepping back and I don't really need to understand the lighting too much? I can just kind of look and say, oh, it's these two characters. They have these expressions. I'm just reading the story. I'm reading what's going on. Again, the extreme of that would be you're watching Ridley Scott's Alien, and there is a writhing mass of pipes, / maybe it's an alien, / maybe it's steam. Who knows what's going on? I may die at any moment, and the only thing that's going to help me is me perceiving through form exactly whether or not that is something that is going to kill me. So hopefully that sort of gives you a good sort of baseline understanding of how this can sort of affect things. And again, I think it's really interesting to look at how it does affect things with something as basic as cinema, where you would assume that it's going to be all a matter of sort of form and reality, etc. So let's look at a couple more sort of examples and sort of see how this may play out across different elements of style. Now, one of the things that is interesting is that frequently you do see particular genres and types of art, different mediums tend to lean into one thing versus another, as do different types of story. So if you look at your normal cartoon style, something like The Simpsons or something like Bluey, you are seeing a lot of shape. You're seeing a lot of these different sort of objects placed around the place. The role that lighting plays is almost zero. You will see even in a lot of these shots, if you watch sort of the Bluey cartoon, you can see a lot of shots where there is lighting and they're trying to make it feel like it has mood, but that rarely actually affects the characters. And one of the interesting things is that because we don't want to necessarily make light and dark really push the form and give us that maybe confusing sense of what is going on in the frame, I have to use my perception to understand it. It's a lot easier when things are just all clear and bright and colorful. Often you see that other thing that we've talked about on the Drawing Codex, which is color versus tonal contrast. So often cartoons do lean much more into color contrast as a way to separate light and dark. Because like if you look back here, you can see here we got a tree, and we've also got shadows in a lot of these houses, and actually everywhere kind of has shadows in the background, but the differential is there through color, right? So we got here's the lit side, which is a, see if I can get here. It's going to let me actually get there. Boom. Yeah. So it's kind of like this pinky sort of color. And then if we look at the shadow, right, it's still from a value standpoint is almost 100%. And this one probably is going to be pretty similar. Yeah, it's sort of at 87. And we just sort of add a very sort of saturated pink. So that's a good example of how through style you choose something that is more shape-based. There's not a lot of form, but you still need to put form in there, but you don't want the form, the light and the dark, the shadow to really be the primary thing that you're perceiving. So we add color contrast, and that gives us a feeling of light and dark without really sort of making us think about the lighting too much. So very interesting how often that happens with style. And the reason I break all these concepts up and make so many sort of videos about them on the Drawing Codex is I think if you can start to piece these things apart in your mind, it gives you a more nuanced way that you may be able to combine styles that no one's kind of seen before. And I think that really is the key to understanding style and so looking at these things. Because often, again, we do perceive and look at cartoony styles versus realistic styles. And that's a very broad, unnuanced way to look at it. And I think, again, you can get very sophisticated. As you will see, you often do when people move into something like the clean line style. But again, before we do that, just as a good example, this is one of the ones I always use in courses to explain this concept that we did mention previously, and there'll be a link to this in the description, maybe at the end as well. Tonal contrast versus color contrast. You see with most of these cartoon images, right, if we take the color out, they basically just sort of turn gray. right? They sort of don't have a lot of value contrast in there inherently. And especially with The Simpsons, you can see it all just goes very, very gray. So again, just another one of those interesting things. I always use this kind of Simpsons one when I'm sort of trying to teach this stuff, because I think it's so important to understand that color contrast frequently plays a major role over value contrast in entertainment design products, especially when you're looking at sort of more cartoony kids-focused things. Again, or something like The Simpsons, where, again, if you really look at it, I mean, these colors make no sense, right? It's such a weird thing. Purple cupboards, everything's sort of orange, everything's day glow. But yeah, it works and people love it, right? And that's the important thing. But again, you often have a good combination. I think this is often where you get really interesting styles. Something like Hergé's Tintin is something where we are primarily, I would say almost entirely, looking at shape-based contrast or object-based contrast, where the primary way you perceive the image is through different shapes, different objects, and you really kind of think of like, oh, here's Tintin, here's his hair, here's his sort of top, here's his pants, etc. And even when we look at this complicated set of things in the background, it's very clear to sort of delineate one object from another. And there's almost no sense of light or dark in the scene. There's no light source, there's no shadows, there's no nothing. But Tintin is a product that is enjoyed by millions of people. Tons of people love it. Kids, right, adults like this because even though the style there is quite simple, often the stories are a little bit more sophisticated and everything kind of is semi-realistic in the way it's sort of rendered proportionally. The backgrounds are often very realistic. And again, you see a lot of this kind of stuff in sort of a few other sort of French comic books that are very sort of classic that I'll show you in a minute. But again, here's a good example of where we have the 3D animated movie of Tintin, which I mean, actually, personally, I didn't hate it. I'm probably the kind of person who should hate it because I was a huge fan of Tintin, and normally any adaptation is terrible, but I actually thought it was quite good. But yeah, they had to really look at the style, right? And you can see the degree to which they had to really figure out how to get 3D and get it that 3D sort of look while still maintaining some of the feel. But yeah, it's interesting that when you do transition away from something that is that two-dimensional and that stylized, you are adding a lot of this form contrast, right? So if we sort of take the Tintin, right, we take the color out, then, it's sort of nothing is there. We're primarily viewing this by sort of object. If we, right, take the color out here, it's almost still there. But the way we're perceiving this is primarily through the form. The form plays a major role in the movie, whereas shape plays a major role in the actual book. And again, depending on what your style needs to be, you can lean on one of these or the other. All right, but here's some other sort of good examples, I think, that just sort of typify the French clean line style, which I think often does a good job of kind of mixing in this more flat style, again, like Tintin, with realistic subject matter, which again is it's just to kind of illustrate how you can mix these things up and get interesting results. So here we've got Anteri's book by Leo, and you can see that this is everything's very proportionate. The story is very realistic. It's very mature, but you have this kind of real sort of fun style of kind of rendering, right? And this is obviously traditionally colored, but this is frequently what you'll see, and this sort of style does work. These books are relatively popular, but there's not a real feeling of light and dark in here. It's mainly sort of one shape on top of another. Yes, there is rendering, but again, what you really see is, we're not seeing that sort of film noir look, right? This feels to me a little bit more like that kind of Wes Anderson style of, hey, we've got sort of one shape on front of another. Yes, there's rendering, but it's not the thing that's really defining the way we understand the image, as opposed to some of these shots in Blade Runner where the lighting really is a major thing, and not just a thing, but it's often a major part of how we communicate and understand the image. You can see here, again, we have this sort of classic shot, and it's not just that like, oh, they've chosen to represent the form with sort of light and dark, it's that actually gives us a very different feeling that might be tricky to get if you were using something like the sort of Wes Anderson rendering style in your film. Is the feeling that he is lit from behind and his face is occluded from light, and being able to hide the features in that way allows you to tell story and tell interesting things. The fact that he is kind of blending in with the environment, and you're kind of seeing this ambiguity about the character, is part of the story. So the type of stories you need to tell and the storytelling methods that you employ are very much going to be affected by the type of style that you use. So if we look at something like, for another sort of good comic example here, we've got Frank Miller's Sin City. This is obviously a black and white comic, but it really does lean in obviously to light and dark. Now, there are plenty of black and white comics that are very much shape-based. They really sort of focus on one shape versus another. There's not a lot of lighting here. Frank Miller's Sin City is not one of those. This really is just fully understood by these abstract, again, very film noir looking light and dark graphic shapes. And although it's not 100% realistic in the way that it is rendered, we can see that kind of style and that sort of graphic nature is very much helping to give the viewer that feeling of ambiguity, that feeling of like, what is going on? This is complex, and things are in shadow, things are in light, and this idea of things being hidden, things being shown, things being occluded from our understanding is very much a major storytelling point. And again, it leads us back to that. What am I looking at? Is this a writhing mass of pipes and steam, or is there an alien in there? Am I going to die, right? Am I walking through the forest at night with just a glimmer of moonlight? And is that a tiger? Is that just something rustling in the wind? Is that something that's going to eat me? These are things that kind of come up and will tend to suit a book or a style or an illustration or a video game, whatever, that, again, needs to have those kind of feelings and emotions. And I think that feeling of moral ambiguity is very much present in Frank Miller's Sin City. And obviously, I think without that style, that book would not be the same. And you can see how they try and sort of mirror that when they did translate it into a film. Another good example of cartooniness that sort of has more rendering, you've got Arcane, sort of League of Legends product from Netflix, and I've just got a couple of sort of frames here. Obviously, it's a very complicated style they use, but yeah, it's kind of a mix, but you can see how this is a good example of, it's more cartoony, but there is a real feeling of wanting to represent form and structure within the face and within the world and the dimensionality. And I mean, I think from a stylistic point of view, that really is trying to make it feel as if this kind of more illustrated, cartoony look is more real. And that sort of does something that allows you to both suspend your disbelief, but maybe believe in it a little bit more, as opposed to something like, these sort of Tintin books or something like that, which again, has a particular look, right? It's not as sort of gritty or as moody. And, you sort of need to really be comfortable with that style, I guess, to sort of read it. Because it does feel very sort of comic booky if you're just kind of looking at that. So again, all these things facilitate a particular type of story that's able to be told, considering the viewer and what they're going to want. But yeah, Arcane is a good example of cartoony product, again, made for a slightly older audience than something like Bluey or The Simpsons, although The Simpsons is all ages, but yeah, certainly something like Bluey. And I think, leaning into that more sort of form-based thing makes it much more palatable for an older audience. And also probably, it also probably has more themes of moral ambiguity than something like Bluey. And again, just something that is sort of worth looking at, and something that, again, I'll probably unpack as we do a few more of these kind of videos and really sort of looking at it, is how I think you can really blend a lot of these things. And once you have good control and you're not necessarily limited by your technical abilities, it is possible to tell one story and have, especially in comics but even in film, even in illustration, even in animation, different scenes will rely on different methodologies for understanding the world. So here you got some Mobius or Jean Giraud, classic sort of French comic book artist. And, this page here is very much more of that shape-based French clean line style. A bit more similar to Tintin. There's no real rendering, right? Like, yes, we have some light and dark on the jacket to help us understand the form, but that is not represented anywhere else. And it's basically just light comes from above, and this kind of helps us to understand the world. So there's a vague sense of like light coming from above, but that's about it. And here you can see again, we've got this kind of scene, and like just firstly, super good scene there. Really solid perspective and a lot of other stuff that just is easy to kind of pass you by. But very sophisticated image, taking a lot of different skills and putting them together to make it look easy. But still, even though there is a sense of rendering, sense of materials, there's no real sense of light. Right, so we have reflections, but we don't have a lot of shadows being cast, if that makes sense. And it's an interesting way, again, that styles are being blended. There's a sense of reflection, which is a sense of lighting, but there's no sense of actual lighting itself, of like the characters aren't casting shadows, they're casting reflections, but not shadows. And again, that's sort of very important to look at. And it's often these subtleties that give us this real sense of fantasy, of disbelief. Again, same thing here, right? Great panels, but still not a lot of rendering. And here we have the same book, right? Same artist, still Mobius. But because I think Jean Giraud or Mobius had a good understanding of form, he drew a lot of Western comics like Blueberry, as in like sort of cowboys and Indian style Western comics. And, they were rendered with a lot more form than you'll see in some of the sort of other clean line styles he had. So he has a good understanding of how to render form. It becomes a choice. And then some of these scenes where we need to have this feeling of light and dark, of this sort of sacred geometry emanating light, then you can see that the artist is capable of doing that and mixing and matching different things with a combination of cast shadows, actual form, and different sort of techniques, right? And again, it's often this interesting interplay that allows you to get sort of different effects. And this is also something that you see when, people will have maybe not something that's quite like Alien, but, anyway, you need a horror scene or you need more drama or more sort of tension, you will tend to kind of drop the lights, make us focus a little bit more on the light and the dark. And it's also often the contrast between these things within the movie, within the product, within the comic, within the story, that allows you to have different experiences and tell different aspects of the story. So it is interesting that in a lot of the sort of first Alien movie, the ship is very white and airy and open and has a very aesthetic. It's very sort of clean. Again, it has that sort of Kubrick-esque sort of 2001 Space Odyssey style view of how spaceships are going to look, all white, all clean. And that's contrasted with the sort of eventuality of what happens in that movie, where the lights get turned off, the alien comes out, there's smoke, fog, sparks, flames, etc. And this makes it hard to understand what's going on. And it's this contrast between those two things that often really gives you the impact, because as a viewer, you're drawn between different emotional sort of ways of understanding the image. And just fundamentally, if you are given an image like this, right, where we have, the classic Geiger designed Ridley Scott Alien, you're kind of just, you can't help but try and figure out what that thing is. And again, that takes up a lot of brain space. So yeah, always interesting to see kind of how you may apply these things to different styles. Hopefully that gives you a good just framework of what on earth I'm talking about when it comes to form versus shape, or form versus object shape, or how you can use symbology and iconography to represent the world, without necessarily rendering a lot of form. It's important to note, one last thing I'll sort of say is often, again, these things are frequently limited by our ability as artists when we're creating our style to show form, because rendering a lot of form can often be something that takes a lot of foundational skill. And you can see when you have someone like Mobius who is able to really sort of do a good combo of both, that again, you have flexibility. You can do whatever you want. I think that's where you're going to find the most freedom as an artist, because even though you may render something and say, hey, like I don't want heaps of rendering, you can still see that in order to create these panels, the artist would have had to understood all of the anatomy, all of the form, all of the structure. It's a matter of how you're showing it and representing it. Think of that in a similar way to being a cinematographer or a director of a film. The form exists, the set's there. It's the lighting or lack of lighting or amount of fill light or ambient light that kind of takes away the lighting, that will really sort of define how your viewer perceives the scene, and that's key. So this doesn't always change how much you need to learn in terms of drawing. This really is a matter of a stylistic choice that will give you more freedom to express what you want as an artist. Okay, so hopefully that helped you understand this concept of form versus shape. I think the real takeaway here that is worth understanding is that you have a picture that you're presenting to your viewer, and depending on how complicated or difficult to understand that picture is, it's going to give them more or less stress. There's the idea of the image being difficult to understand or easy to understand. Something that's more open, like those Wes Anderson shots, like a Bluey cartoon, it's very easy for us to understand. It's one of the beauties of comic book work and our ability to work in a line and color style or sort of a flat color style. We're sort of presenting something and it's more iconic, it's more object-based, it's more shape-based. It's very easy for people to understand. In the same way, icons are very easy to understand. Icon of a face, of a hammer. It's very easy. We're like, oh, I know what that is. And there's something very comforting about that when you're telling a story that way. So it's important to, I think of it more like this, versus if you are, Frank Miller, you're creating Sin City as this black and white thing where often pages are, you need to decipher what's going on. Like, what is going on with that frame? We've got all these film noir sort of hidden, playing with black and white, playing with light, and your ability to understand it. Like a lot of people, I think, would look at a Sin City page and just be like, I do not know what that means, right? You often need to kind of get into it, start reading a bit of it to really understand. So there's the openness versus a sort of a closed or hard to understand, an image that is challenging to the viewer, like our pictures of a character who's shrouded in darkness, or your picture of Geiger's alien that is kind of hidden from us and writhing around. It's a challenging image. It challenges the viewer, and some stories are really going to benefit from that. For instance, if you look at the camera setup here that I have, a lot of people will recommend for a YouTuber to have good 3-point lighting, so you really sort of emphasize the form. But again, the lighting setup that I have is fairly flat. The lighting on my face is relatively flat. There's not a lot of form you can perceive on my face. I have something that is kind of like a rim light to help separate me from the background a little bit. But you'll notice I am wearing a black shirt, not by accident, just so I can illustrate this point. And you kind of can't really perceive the form. There's no real perception of one thing on top of another, because again, I don't have a lot of form-based lighting on this. If I was wearing a white shirt, you would obviously perceive what's going on a lot more. Likewise, if I turn off that main light, all you can see is the rim light. And this gives things much more of a mysterious, hard to understand view. Your understanding of what's going on in my face and my expression and the hand gesture is very much based on where these things are in relation to light. And I can have some things that are in the light, and I can have some things that are in the shadow, and this makes it much more challenging to understand. Not so good if you're just trying to sort of talk and give people information on YouTube. So this is probably a little bit better. It's more open, it's easier to understand, and again, that's why I don't have a lot of 3-point lighting in this particular setup. Even better is if I wear a white shirt, right? Separates me from the background, it's more object-based. much easier to understand. Makes me feel less like some creepy sort of Bond villain or something like that. So anyway, just a quick example of how this sort of stuff might actually work, no matter what you're doing. And if you haven't already, check out this video on tonal versus color contrast, because it's directly related to everything we've just been talking about.